Septimus Warren Smith, the traumatized war veteran, doesn't occupy a huge number of pages in Mrs Dalloway, but his figure and his fate loom large across those pages, I think. We learn quite a lot about his background. We learn his history, his class position. We're told that before the war, um, he was a clerk in Mr. Brewer's establishment, and he continues that work after the war. He's taken to be a clerk of the better sort, which means that he's well presented, sort of successful within the class limits that have been set for him. He's seen as half-educated, self-educated, and that's in fact correct. He is self-educated to some extent. He has a passion for literature, significantly enough. We learn that he's taken continuing ed classes, particularly from a woman named Miss Isabel Pole, who has lectured on Shakespeare, and he obviously has a infatuation with her. She looms quite large in his memories and in his consciousness. And I think there's a gulf between them, a gulf between her educated position. She probably comes from a more educated class position, and it's a class position to which he aspires, but not directly. He aspires to it through culture. So he reads Shakespeare, he reads Darwin, he reads Bernard Shaw. When war breaks out, he volunteers and goes to fight, and we're told he goes to fight for some sort of image of Shakespeare and Miss Isabel Pole. That's his motivating image of national identity, we might say. And he serves through the war, the whole of the war, and he's particularly close to his officer, Evans. It's another of those very close wartime male relationships that we see. Evans, we learn, is killed quite late in the war, at which point it seems that he loses all sense of feeling. He experiences some sort of emotional dislocation or disassociation, and at the end of the war he could not feel. None of the things that excited him before the war, Shakespeare for example, have any impact now. He has lost his ability to feel. That, of course, is the first symptom of his mental breakdown. Now we have Rezia. He's married during the war, towards the end of the war, when he's stationed in Italy. He's living in a house in Milan, and marries Rezia, the daughter. She comes to London with him. She is a hat maker, a milliner, and she's compared throughout to a bird. Her movements are very often seen as bird-like. She's a bird sheltering under the thin hollow of a leaf, we're told. She's also seen at one point as a flowering tree. These are images of nature within the city. Her bird-like quality, I think, makes her particularly attractive to Septimus, though he doubts very much whether his feelings for her are correct, and he recognises at certain points that she is in a great deal of sort of distress because of his mental condition. Now, Septimus's symptoms, we get a very, I think, vivid and powerful impression of Septimus's mental illness, and I think it's usually taken for granted that Virginia Woolf was in part drawing on her own experiences of mental illness here for some of the symptoms that Septimus experiences. Like Septimus, for example, she had auditory hallucinations. The birds sang to her in Greek, and she had these mental collapse. So she also had significant experience of the mental health treatment of the day. Now, Septimus's symptoms, we're told, are I think it's sort of wise to assume that they're directly tied to his war experience. His mental state may have been somewhat fragile before, but it's the war experience that has shattered him and given rise to this psychotic break with reality. He experiences visual hallucinations. An old woman's head in the middle of a fern is something he sees. He can see through bodies, we're told. Bodies become translucent or transparent to him. He imagines his own body spread out on a rock as a sort of a web of nerves, which is, a strange pathological image, but it's an image that actually fits the novel very well, because we very often, I think, get the sense of the interconnection between characters and their experiences being web-like, not being a single kind of spherical, self-contained ego, but a series of sensations spread out. The image might remind us, if you know T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was a poem that T.S. Eliot wrote some years before he wrote The Wasteland, in that the central character, the speaker of the poem, J. Alfred Prufrock, imagines his nerves cast out like a web on a screen. So it's a very similar image here, the body spread on a rock. And I think what that speaks to is a sort of terrifying sense that, well, if he can see through bodies, other people can see through him. So he is entirely exposed to the unkind, often violent or brutish scrutiny of others, particularly, of course, the doctors. He has a strong sense of the presence of the dead. Evans is about to reappear. Evans is there. Evans, his great friend, has somehow not gone from the world as far as Septimus is concerned, but is always about to come back, which is terrifying, of course. He has a powerful sense of grandiosity. He imagines that he alone, as it says, was called forth in advance of the mass of men to hear the truth. He has delusions of grandeur, we might say. He sees himself as a messianic figure, a Christ figure. He experiences extreme euphoria. Beauty was everywhere, joy was everywhere. In between, the utter desolation of the spirit that he experiences. And I think it's worth seeing Septimus not as categorically different from the other characters, but often strangely echoing them. So the intense pleasure and excitement that Clarissa sometimes takes from the London scene, that Peter Walsh occasionally takes from the things around him, this sense that beauty was everywhere, could very well apply to those characters as well. But of course that's only one of them shifting moods, and I'm not suggesting in any way that Peter Walsh and Clarissa Dalloway are losing touch with reality, that they're experiencing mental breakdown, and Septimus clearly is. But I think Woolf is quite keen to establish a series of echoes. So if beauty was everywhere, on the other hand, Septimus experiences the world without meaning. He learns after the war that the great books that he has admired actually have a secret to them, and the secret is that human beings are horrible, they're awful, they're repulsive. There are various images for Septimus. I've just picked on a couple. He's imaged as a drowned sailor on a rock, and this might remind us, if we're reading carefully, of Clarissa Dalloway herself, imagining herself far, far out at sea and utterly alone at one point early in the narrative. To live through one day, Clarissa thinks, is very dangerous, and that's certainly true for Septimus, who doesn't live through the day. He commits suicide, of course, when the doctors come to fetch him. He's also imagined by Miss Isabel Polar's John Keats, which I think is an interesting image for a sort of suffering, poetic sensibility. Keats, like Septimus, was only half-educated, as we're told. Keats wasn't able to attend university. He was a Cockney, or he was seen as a Cockney. In other words, a rather lower class person than many of the other great Romantic poets of the time who were highly educated. Keats was sort of learning as he went along, but he was also sickly and frail, like Septimus. I think some of the most remarkable passages turning around Septimus's character are those that deal with the doctors, and it's a powerfully grim and rather negative portrayal of the treatment of mental illness at this time. We have Dr. Holmes, the GP, who's sort of hale and hearty and thinks that health is largely a matter of our own control. He emphasizes duty and clearly is sort of oblivious to Septimus's sufferings. He thinks that if Septimus put his mind to it, he could simply get better. And he becomes a hate figure for Septimus. Septimus sees him as brutal. He's the brute. He is human nature incarnate, red of nostril, a terrifying image of human cruelty. And then we have the specialists, Sir William Bradshaw, the Harley Street doctor, the nerve specialist, the priest of science, we're told, who is highly paid, highly successful. He's made a great career out of medicine. He's not born to the highest class, but he's become very successful because of it and treats the upper classes. Bradshaw seems more understanding, though Retzier, of course, likes him less. And he does recognize that Septimus is in the grip of an acute crisis, and he plans to put him into a home of some sort and give him residential treatment. But for him, the big issue is not, as he says, having a sense of proportion. He doesn't use the word madness. He says he doesn't have a sense of proportion. And he recommends the rest cure. Now, the rest cure is this very controversial notion from the late 19th century. It was invented by the American S. Weir Mitchell. And the rest cure, the idea was complete and total rest and absence of any kind of mental stimulation. Lots of eating, lots of rich food as a way of regaining weight. And the body will somehow cure the mind. Virginia Woolf herself had been subject to this treatment and had learned that it was actually a terrible kind of treatment, pretty much disastrous. If you've read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper, that's another story about the consequences of the rest cure. You'll know the terrible outcome of that story. The rest cure, in fact, exacerbates the mental instability of the characters and produces much more extreme versions of mental breakdown. There's a fascinating passage on page 100 where we're told that Sir William Bradshaw's sense of proportion is closely related to, is sister to, the goddess of conversion. And here I think Woolf makes this fascinating connection between what's going on through medical science, through the exercise of power in medical science, and conversion in the sense of violently getting people to submit to ideas, which is seen as something that goes hand in hand with imperialism. We're told the goddess conversion has stolen out from her hiding place and mounted her throne, that goddess whose lust is to override opposition, to stamp indelibly in the sanctuaries of others the image of herself. And this is the kind of violence, I think, that underlies the seemingly benign approach of Sir William Bradshaw. And I think it's a terrifying image of psychiatric power, as we might call it. And it's that, I think, ultimately that causes Septimus to panic and to leap from the window to his death.